ابتغاء وجهه سبحانه وتعالى وثوابه وقربه. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما. سبحانك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك. ولك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد إذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الأولين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الآخرين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الملأ الأعلى إلى يوم الدين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we praise and thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again infinitely for allowing us to see another Ramadan. Moving into the last 10 days, what is the state of a believer? Tired, worn out, preparing for Eid shopping and Eid baking. Whereas the last 10 days is the last stretch. If you're in a marathon race, what do people usually do when they're running a marathon? Is they preserve, they have to run along, or they've got to do many laps, but they preserve energy for the last few laps. And then that's where the winners are differentiated. The guy who paced himself and prepared and knew that those last couple of laps he needs a burst of energy, he doesn't wear himself out from the beginning. So the last 10 days is very similar. The Prophet ﷺ, they would say that in the last 10 days, كان يشد مئزرته. He would, in English we can say, he would tie his belt. The mi'zara was the cloth that the Arabs would wear, but tying it had two meanings. One meaning was that he had absolutely no interaction or relations with his wives. And the other meaning is that he was determined to devote himself to ibadah and worship in these last 10 days of Ramadan. In these last 10 days of Ramadan, and the way it's practiced in these parts, it's a very beautiful tradition where people would go to the masjid or to any place women could seclude themselves even in a portion of their home and completely dedicate themselves for the ibadah and the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is in fact this used to be required for a person in their normal life in times gone by. And it's more so required in this age of social media, where a person can dedicate themselves in the masjid, preferably without their phone. Or if they need to use their phone, then from the beginning they automatically, or they should consciously allocate the times in which they would use their phones. In many of the institutions now as well, where students are studying the deen, they would have a rule that students are not allowed to use their phone. They give it to them on a Thursday, or certain institutions will give it to them at a certain time from 1 o'clock or to 1:30. And we find even there are certain scholars as well. We met some scholars, alhamdulillah, they would not have the internet in their homes. He would come to an office and sit there from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And that's the time for his internet work. So all the emails that he got, all the replies, everything, he receives it at that time and he responds to what he can respond. What he can't respond, he responds at home. The next day when he comes, all the messages that are still pending will get sent out. Right? And this is we would regard this as backward. But these are people who understand that the priority of their life is their time that they spend with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or what they are doing for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And our life is our breath in what the time we are spending. And one of the ways shaitan has creeped up and destroyed people's spirituality is that he has made us involved with people more than we are involved with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Back in the day, when there was no social media, we were involved. If a person was sitting on their own at home, at the very least, there was nothing to do. What would he do? If he had an inclination towards goodness, there was no evil that he could do. So what would he do? If he's a person who was of sound disposition, he'd take up a book and read, or he'd pick up the mushaf and he'd recite some Quran, or he'd take the misbah and he would do some dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the nature of the distractions is that now there is always something else to do besides the things we're supposed to be doing. So there's world events to follow on a daily basis, on an hourly basis on what's happening. And even though we know that nothing much could have happened in the past hour, we still have to just check the news to see perhaps something. Whereas in the past, Even those people that had televisions in their home, how often would they watch the news? Once a day. At 8 o'clock at night, even the kids, when they were watching their programs, 8 o'clock, dad had to watch his news, khalas, all those programs was. But once a day for half an hour, that was when the news was. Or in the morning, 7 o'clock, you're driving to work, or 8 o'clock work. Two times of the day, people caught up on the news. And the rest of the day, what did they do? They lived their lives, right? Where someone said life is happening, right? So now, today, we are living our entire lives following other people live their lives, right? And if we look at this, what is the essence of the life of a believer? If a person has to think of the highest level that a believer ought to be in, which is impossible for human beings to actually exist, but this is what the state of the prophets and the elect of the awliya were. If a person wants to know what it is that is why Imam Ghazali wrote his Bidayatul Hidayah. And he sets out the complete program from the time you wake up till the time you're supposed to sleep, what you're supposed to be doing. When you wake up, you do this, then you do this. At the first hour of the morning, you do this. And you have an option of doing then this, then that. And when Dhuhr time comes, you do this. And these adhkar have to be done at Dhuhr. And these types of studies have to be done at this particular time when Asr comes. And he gives the entire day. And he even gives that. And if you need to be working to earn a living, then this is the time to go and work. And now a person might practice, okay, and he's doing this because you want to study these books by implementing. And so you put it into practice, and you're like, okay, what, something is going to happen. Maybe, a person will get an opening or whatever. And he says, now once you're on this, continue doing this for the rest of your life. There's nothing else. The whole purpose of life is to find a routine in which when the time of death comes, there is a beautiful routine to be on, and you're in a good state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then ultimately, if a person is on those routines, it is to have presence with Allah constantly, 24/7. For a person never to be negligent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in everything that they're doing. It's not just an ordinary sense, but a heightened sense of consciousness. And if a person is someone who does dhikr regularly, then we find those moments of presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now in Ramadan, it is hoped that everyone would have already found those moments of presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, either in their Taraweeh Salah or in their recitation of Quran or in any good deed which they were doing. And Allah is so merciful that it is impossible for someone, any believer, to go through Ramadan except that Allah would already have given them some of those moments. And that moment, sometimes it can last a few seconds, it can last a few raka'ats, it could last a few ayats of Quran. Allah opens these up to teach us what the state of the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are with Him constantly. Not just in every day or few minutes in a day, but in every breath. And obviously the status of the prophets were even higher. In that even in their comings and goings and dealings, they were with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as someone would be in the recitation of Quran. And the purpose of the i'tikaf is to train the heart to taste something of these states. And the preparation for Ramadan, as we said, was coming up to these last 10 days. The way we lived our life in the beginning of Ramadan, the first 10, 20 days, is so that finally now in the last 10 days we are completely focused. We found our routine, we've gotten over the appetites, and now the ibadah has become focused. We found what works for us, the timings of the mornings. It takes at least 3 weeks for a habit to change. 3 weeks to 40 days for a habit to change. And some people begin their preparation for Ramadan in the month of Rajab already, Rajab Sha'ban. And other people begin their preparation for Ramadan from the first day of Shawwal. They begin preparing for the next days, or for the next year's Ramadan, in terms of the tertib, the program, the daily things that we ought to do. And again, and people ask this question often, we don't realize and it's like a messiah into your spirituality, this social media. You can build up for years and years and years and years and years. And one day can destroy years of preparation. That is how detrimental these devices and the social media is, because it takes you completely out of presence. In fact, it makes you have presence with creation, the presence that you ought to have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't leave a believer without weapons. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never allow believers to be overcome without giving them a recourse to techniques, and the wise use the same weapons of the enemy against them. And so these same technological devices, if people use them wisely, can also be the greatest means of people approaching and reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it requires extreme discipline. And so the phone can mean one person's destruction, and it can mean one person's elevation. And if having presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means being conscious, a heightened sense of awareness, and it's a what they would call a hal, or a state of being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that everything that we are doing, a person is, we say, for the sake of terminologies, we say the person is aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, watching them. But it is a sense of being in that a person doesn't even see themselves doing things. It is Allah doing things for them. Some people would imagine that Allah is watching me. Some people would imagine that I am doing things with the permission of Allah. And those in the higher station see that it is not even me doing it. Did I perform salah? No, Allah performed the salah, and my limbs were just used, right, as a means of honoring me. And Allah is so generous, He will still give me the reward for that. It is impossible for the human nature to be in this constant presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 24/7. And that is why the Prophet also said there's a time for this and there's a time for that. And this is for the ordinary believers. But we have, for example, these devices in which you can keep adhkar playing in the background 24/7. So even if you're not paying attention, but subconsciously what's happening, your soul is still registering. And the way to test yourself whether that actually has an effect or not is if a person has or does dhikr constantly, even with listening to. If a person is lazy, they can put on any of these recordings and listen to the dhikr and do it with the recording. In the past, a person didn't, if they didn't have it, if he needed presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he needed to be conscious of doing dhikr or making dua. And if he wanted to have a support, then he had to do dhikr in a group. But a person on their own can keep the dhikr playing. And while the dhikr is playing, you can use the dhikr also to make dua. And you can use it for contemplation. And it is almost like someone described it like a drip into the soul, which is constantly feeding the soul. And to see that that does actually affect the soul is when it's not there. If a person has been listening and doing dhikr for a long while, or even just listening to dhikr and not doing it with your own tongue, but you're concentrating over the meaning, or you're using the dhikr as a means of bringing awareness and consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to whatever you're doing, is the instant it stops, what happens? The person starts to feel tired. And if the dhikr is playing, then the soul doesn't get tired. This is a crutch, it's still a crutch. But it means that what happening is the soul is still benefiting. And our mashayikh would even say, some of these technological devices, notwithstanding all of the evil that it contains, and notwithstanding all of the detriment that it has on a person, obviously who is not disciplined, he says it is one of the biggest blessings of the times. Few people know how to use it correctly. And so you have a knife. It's like all of us have chosen to take this knife and just stab ourselves. But that same knife we can go and slaughter and feed people and do good. So why have we chosen to allow the evil of it to affect us, and we haven't chosen? And it's the same thing as discipline. When the time for adhan goes, a person has to stop what they're doing and go read salah. Discipline is about saying no to certain things and saying yes to certain things. And when it comes to the devices as well, it's the ability to say, khalas, stop. I don't need to watch that next news article. I watch the news in the morning. There shouldn't be much that has changed since the morning. A person can be concerned about the ummah, but if being concerned about the ummah is making you neglect your duties to yourself, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to your family, and to the Quran, and to Ramadan, then where did that concern of the ummah take you? It's like They would say in the past, those Vicks chappies, they used to have the writings inside. A person who's, is so concerned about his health, he jogs like 20 hours a day. Life is going by and he's jogging. So say jog and die healthy. The guy who's the guy who jogs is going to die a healthy death. He'll be in a healthy state when he dies, and the other guy is also going to die. But what does it mean prioritizing? There are times for this, there are times for that, and knowing what to give the amount of time that it requires. This requires wisdom. The definition of wisdom in the terminology of the Arabs was putting everything in its appropriate place. It's also how much time should be spent on this particular thing, how much time should be spent on that particular thing. In Tareem, for example, back in the day, if a person went to work and they would live hand to mouth. So the guy knew to get my lunch, I need this amount of money. So he goes to his shop. And many people say you can go sometimes to Tareem still 10, half past 10, and they still haven't opened some of them, their shops. Because he knows from 10 to 12, I know my routine. I'll get a few customers. By lunchtime, I have what I need to go and buy my lunch. So they're not running after. And what is he doing in that morning time? Generally, they would attend the general lessons, even that the students of knowledge would attend, and the dhikrs that used to take place. Or some of them would open up early in the morning. As soon as he's gotten what he needs for the day, he closes shop and he goes home. He spends time with his family. And he's free in that particular, he's not bound by an 8 to 5, an 8 to 5 job, right? But unfortunately, we've been trained in the West to serve the system, right? And so we can't even extricate ourselves out of the system, what they call the rat race. And for a person to think about ways and means of escaping the rat race so that you can live your life first and foremost for yourself and do the things you want to do, and then do the things that society requires us to do, and then ultimately living a life which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is also one of the greatest deceptions and oppressions of our age. We spoke about the economic oppression, where people are bound to a system and you're not allowed to escape from that system. And so the i'tikaf gives a person time to recalibrate. But there has to be a condition. And that condition is, unfortunately, it's the same thing that we don't teach our huffaz. We want all our children to become huffaz. And we will promise them the car, we will promise them a new phone, which is actually a damage to the child who's going to become a hafiz. But we know in the past we'll encourage our children. But how many people have actually taught their children, or how many teachers have actually impressed upon their students that you want to become hafiz? Alhamdulillah. But this is not a commitment for 1 year. It's not a commitment for 2 years or part-time or 3 months if they memorize fast. This is a commitment you are making to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the rest of your life. That every day for at least half an hour to 1 hour, you're giving that hour to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to recite your Quran, to memorize your Quran, and then to revise. Because a hafiz who doesn't do dawra, doesn't do his revision, what happens? And how many hufaz don't we know who memorize Quran and then they've forgotten, and they memorize again and they've forgotten? Why? Is because that commitment from the beginning, that this is not just a 1 year, 1.5 year thing, it's a dedication. That 1 hour or at least half an hour, if we say that the hafiz in today's times is only reading one juz, whereas we know they used to say in the past that the hafiz has to read at least 3 ajza on a daily basis. And 3 ajza, if we read fast, takes 1 hour. If you read with medium pace, it will take at least 1.25 hours. But even if we said 1 hour, half an hour of a day, how many children are taught when they're doing hifz that I have to give up half an hour of my life for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the rest of my life? And then not only half an hour, the child must choose from when he's doing the hifz. You decide from now which is that half an hour. That come, as they say, hell or high waters, you will never sacrifice that half an hour for anyone else besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They would even joke and say, even if Malik al-Maut comes telling him, this is my time with Allah. What does this mean? It means commitment. Allah has given us our breaths, Allah has given us our hours of our day. We have 24 hours in a day. How much of that do we give to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Just for Allah, meaning nothing else. And not by the way thing, meaning we've taken that time out for Allah, not at 5 times salah, which we have to do, in which we also just do on autopilot, many of us. This is time for Allah. And what the i'tikaf teaches us is to learn to find that time and say, for the rest of my life, at least, even if it's just these 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes before Fajr, 10 minutes after Fajr, 10 minutes. And here in these Western lands, the best time for this is the time either before Fajr or the time after Fajr to Ishraq. There is generally a quiet time where people are generally, if they're reading Salah, going back to sleep. And if they're not reading Salah, they're sleeping. And unless a person has a very hectic work schedule, then they're leaving for work early in that morning. But even if they're leaving for a work schedule, if they're in a car on their own, that could also be a time for them to be alone with Allah. And so i'tikaf teaches us to learn how to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so therefore one of the conditions for i'tikaf as well is that a person spends the i'tikaf with who? We said many people say, I'm going to spend i'tikaf with Sheikh so-and-so, and I'm going to this masjid because, but the intention is I am going to spend my i'tikaf with whom? With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And if we're spending i'tikaf with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we are not supposed to be spending our i'tikaf with people. And therefore some of the mashayikh also here in Indonesia, they would have the i'tikaf program in Ramadan for the entire month, 30 days. And they would have one rule. Says you can eat as much as you want, sleep as much as you want. The only rule is no talking. Because the thing that spoils the i'tikaf for people is what? The chit-chat and the catching up on stories, and this happened. And they say that kalam spoils the hal. The greatest thing that spoils that presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just general chatter, talking. And if a person, you can actually, it's almost like you can feel that, you know, when the air is leaving the ball, when it's got a puncture, sometimes when you speak, and you're just speaking for the sake of speaking, you can feel that spiritual balloon, if you want to call it, just being, the air being drawn out. Because the only thing that keeps a person in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the dhikr of Allah. وَمَنْ wala. A person can have a conversation, and you can have a long conversation with someone. It's fine, but is it done with presence? Is it done with consciousness? Imam al-Haddad, they would say, even in speaking to people, while the other person was speaking, his tongue was still moving with La ilaha illallah. And obviously his heart was constantly in that. But even just waiting for a reply for someone, he wouldn't even waste the time. He'd be using it in the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obviously he's completely present with that person that he's speaking to. We also know the saying of our mashayikh. They would say, some people would say at the end of their lives, they would say, for 30 or 40 or 50 years, people thought I was talking to them, but I was only speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This concept of silence also, we know in the story, in the history, there were some people that even in their whole lives, they never spoke. And others chose only to speak. There's a very interesting story about a certain lady. One of the scholars meets a lady, and she only speaks with the verses of the Quran. Anything. So if she wanted her children to bring her something, she finds a verse of the Quran which alludes to whatever it is that she needs. And this is the extent. Obviously, it's not everyone's cup of tea. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has manifested in the history of Islam these examples. And فَلِذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ. Why do we always settle for less? Allah is saying this is, and if Allah is the goal, then فَلِذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ. That is what those who compete need to be competing for. If you're preparing for the Olympics, how much preparation, how much won't you sacrifice because you know how great the goal is? And why, when it comes to our spirituality, do we always settle for less? And we make the excuses because the times have changed. In what extent for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are we willing to go to sacrifice our pleasures, sacrifice our habits for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake? Knowing that time is short, we have only a set amount of breaths. And if we can't do it, we have to at least die trying, right? But we'll sacrifice. And you'll find this, for example, you'll find people who criticize people who sit in i'tikaf. He's going in i'tikaf, or he's going for, they would say that about the Jamaat. He's going for da'wah. He's leaving his wife and his children behind, and. But when it's a business trip to China, then there's no problem with it. Then he live for even the whole month, right? Or there's a conference, they've got to, the work is sending them on the weekend safari, whatever, 3-day workshop, whatever it is. Then, so we're sacrificing all the time, but we're sacrificing for the wrong people. We sacrifice our sleep. Many times we sacrifice our sleep for the sake of a flight, or the sake of a movie, or the sake of some sports. Right? But when that's the first thing is sacrifice. The second thing is, when are we going to push ourselves to the greatest extent and the greatest limits of our potential for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How many of us have ever tried to stay awake at night the whole day for the sake of Allah, and not just sleep at the time of Ishraq? See how far can I actually go with continuing either with that ibadah or that dhikr or whatever it is. And you'll be surprised the strength that the soul actually has. You can pull 2 or 3 days and you won't even feel tired. But for training, for the sports, for the military, they'll push you to the greatest extent. There are Hindu people, they do what's called the silent retreat, right? And they have bases all over the country and in different parts of the world. And what's amazing, it's free. They don't charge you anything. Free accommodation, free food. We even haven't yet got to that level where we can provide free education, free accommodation, free food for people in a free, spiritual retreat. And so they've got different rules in terms of eating this day, but it's a silent retreat. 10 days, absolutely no talking whatsoever. And it's such a profound experience. At the end, they just say, if you've benefited, sponsor someone else to do it. And it's so profound that everyone, not a single person leaves except that they sponsor the person to come. And they're pushing themselves to these limits. For the sake of health, we find people doing water fasting. They stay away from food completely. They don't eat anything. They only drink water. And in Ramadan, we can't even leave one samosa, right? And again, life is passing by. When are we going to start pushing ourselves? When are we going to make these sacrifices? When are we going to enter the competition? We haven't even entered the competition. And these things require community. For a person to do it on their own is very, very, very difficult. Where are we now creating these systems where we can take, and even within a family or amongst some friends, guys, this Ramadan, no fried foods. Not even for the sake of it's a samosa. It's very unhealthy to eat the fried foods when you're fasting. It has a worst effect on your health. When you're fasting to have fried foods, or any unhealthy food when you're fasting in Ramadan has a worse effect on the body than if you had to have it after Ramadan. Because during the day after Ramadan, there's different foods, and obviously the effects are less on the body. But when you're fasting, your body is completely nourishing itself on that you put at the time of iftar and what you put it at night. And so if you eat unhealthy in Ramadan, you end up after Ramadan with worse health than before. So again, curbing the appetites. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us tawfiq and to grant us the himma and determination to want to approach Him with sincerity, determination, and to be willing to make the sacrifices for His sake. And making the sacrifices, and when a person intends to do this, and obviously it's optional, there's nothing that's obligatory on it. A person wants to live their life, eat nicely, sleep nicely, just do the bare basics, just read the 5 times salah and whatever. They're in a safe space, and that person might get to the highest levels. Alhamdulillah. It's Allah's prerogative to give that person according to His will. And if that person has a good opinion that Allah will do that to me, there's no problem at all. That person is not called to account at all. But every person deep down in that knows, am I living to my potential, to my spiritual potential, or am I Am I just cruising by lazily and there's more that I could actually be doing? So every person has to call themselves to account. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us tawfiq, to put into practice, and we never make claims. Even when a person is trying spiritual striving, even the state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Allah, we're testing ourselves, but we're not making any commitments. And we're not making any claims that we have any station with you or that we have any ability. We are, we are trying. And it's a broken effort and it's bound to fail, except if you help us. Because ultimately the ability then to even do it is not from ourselves, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله نستغفر الله نسألك الجنة ونعوذ بك من النار نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله نستغفر الله نسألك الجنة ونعوذ بك من النار نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله نستغفر الله نسألك الجنة ونعوذ بك من النار اللهم إنك عفو تحب العفو فاعف عنا اللهم إنك عفو تحب العفو فاعف عنا اللهم إنك عفو تحب العفو فاعف عنا يا كريم